First of all, David, thank you so much for joining us here.
I'm happy to be with you again, John, even if only virtually this time.
That's it. Well, we want to get you back to Carbondale one day soon. But David, let's maybe even start there, because as you're leaving us, you're heading back home for a couple days, and then we're heading off to China for a period to lecture and meet with students and faculty. So since China has become the epicenter of this crisis, tell us about your impressions of that trip and how that kind of frames what you're looking at right now.
Well, it was a memorable trip. Of course, I'm no China specialist. I don't speak the language. It was only my second time in China ever, but we were there about 5 weeks from the end of September till the 1st of November, mostly teaching at Tsinghua University in Beijing. But before that, we went to the far western China, to Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs are under such terrible oppressive treatment. And our traveling companion was a former congressman from Oregon named David Wu, who was the first Chinese American ever to be elected to the United States House of Representatives. Very proud of that. He's no longer in the Congress. He served 7 terms. So he could speak the language. So we had a wonderful kind of entree to things. So a couple of things made a big impression on me. One is if you had to see the suffocating presence of the surveillance system in cities like Kashgar, in Urumqi, out there in Xinjiang province, to really understand just how oppressive the Chinese state can be when it devotes itself to being so. There were cameras everywhere. I mean, just saturation cameras. Fortified police station every 250 meters. A rolling squad car, like what we would call a paddy wagon, with, we were told, 8 riot police inside, spaced out at 250-meter intervals on every street in the major cities, just everywhere. It was just, to repeat, if you didn't see it with your own eyes, you wouldn't believe it. So that was one thing that made a huge impression on me. Second thing was, we drove one day, long day, across the desert from Tsinghua to Urumqi, 2 principal cities in Xinjiang province. And on the way, we passed through a wind farm, and we clocked it at 35 miles long, and our estimate was about 4 miles wide on each side of the highway. It was the biggest wind farm, more turbines turning than any place I've ever seen in this country. It was, again, another instance of how the Chinese government can muster and focus resources when it chooses to do so. This for a benign purpose, not so much for political repression, but for clean energy. So the third and probably most lasting impression I had came from a series of 3 evening dinner seminars I had with students at 3 different Chinese universities in Beijing. Tsinghua, where I was based, Beida, or Peking University, was the second, and Renmin, the third. And these were all events arranged by students, and they were meant to be as informal and candid and open and so on as could be under the circumstances. And you have to discount some for that, because it is a repressive regime and students are cautious and so on. But even taking that at a discount, there was a moment when the toggle switch went on in my head during this conversation with these students, that all 3 of these conversations, so over the course of the several weeks this happens, it's 100+ students. And it dawned on me, just like, as I say, like a switch went on, that I was having a conversation with a group of young people who loved their country and were extremely proud of their country and were extremely aware of how much their country had achieved in the last generation or 2. And the contrasting life circumstances and life opportunities between their generation and their parents and grandparents. They were just sensitive to that and very, very proud of it. And the depressing thought then followed in my mind that it's been a long time since I had a conversation with a group of American university students who expressed that kind of affection for their country, pride in their country, commitment to being part of their country's future, which all these young people in China, they're eager to get into the game and be part of improving their society's life. It was, I mean, I use a word advisedly, it was inspirational, but it was also depressing to think that that kind of sentiment is decreasingly present amongst American students, at least in my experience.
Well, I mean, that's maybe a wonderful way to kind of begin our conversation, because you're a student of American studies. I think that was your academic discipline. You've been a historian, a teacher, a documentarian. Give us your perspective. I mean, as someone who's, is sitting on Stanford's campus, the heart of Silicon Valley, one of the most dynamic communities in the world, what is going through your head as you look at the unfolding crisis in this country, as you see it on TV, you read, you talk to people, 30,000 feet, what's going on in American life right now?
Well, the short answer, not altogether cynical answer, is not much, because we're on lockdown. Though in this particular area here in Northern California, we went on lockdown or shelter in place earlier than most other regions or subregions. And I have to say, at least in the kind of social circles that I live in and move in, this is much more nuisance than hardship right here. Now, I know that's not true for everybody in the country by any means. And the longer this goes on, the deeper and more damaging the economic impact is going to be. But here it's springtime, and there's no traffic in the roads, and I'm a bicyclist, and there's no cars to worry about on the roads, essentially. But nationally, it's a much different picture, and I do think that the time is the factor here that we really need to focus on. The longer we stay in this kind of state of economic paralysis, the deeper the damage will be, and the more difficult it will be to recover. That's just about a truism, I suppose, but it's understandable to me why so many people are eager to get the economy going again, even at the risk of spiking the infection rate, maybe even the mortality rates. I'm not advising doing that, believe me, but I understand where that sentiment is coming from.
I mean, some have written that this is the most serious challenge, crisis the U.S. has faced since World War II, almost 80 years. Does that strike you as roughly right, or is that hyperbolic?
Well, I'd say it's roughly right, and just at the grossest level, that this is a crisis that has afflicted the entire country, from coast to coast, border to border, and the entire world for that matter. So in that sense, it's more like the Great Depression than any other recent historical event. And it's happened in real time and at a velocity that is just about unprecedented. The speed with which people came face to face with this crisis over a matter of weeks or even days in this country, I think really has very little precedent. For example, though we entered World War II in 1941, we really didn't do any major fighting in the European theater for almost 2 or 3 years after that. And the Great Depression hits, conventionally, we think of it as beginning in 1929, but it took years to roll out fully. It took about 3 years to get to the unemployment rate of 25% in early 1933, late 1932. We got to 20% unemployment in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks here. So the speed factor here is something that I think is unprecedented.
As you think of American life and the response to this crisis, it seems like you can think about it on sort of 3 levels. One is just the citizens and how they've responded. The second would be our institutions and how they've responded. And then third, our leaders. So let's maybe start with the citizenry. I mean, have we proved to be as resilient, as cooperative, as united as we'd like? I mean, compare it again, maybe using the framework of the Depression period.
Well, I'd say yes, so far, that there has been a remarkable, and in my view, admirable degree of citizen cooperation with the idea that we all have to pull in our horns and cut back our normal activities and so on. But we're already seeing a lot of resistance to that on the beaches in Florida and California, for that matter. So it's a question in my mind, I think in a lot of people's mind, just how long will people willingly, significantly distort the normal patterns of their life in the face of a risk that is distributed differently across the age spectrum and maybe across other identity markers that we aren't really aware of yet. Some people are at great risk. The elderly with preconditions are clearly a great risk. The young, and especially the very young, their risk profile is very low. So is there a uniform formula for getting people back out into their normal patterns of life again? I don't know. But I think so far, at least, I've been impressed with how willingly people have cooperated with the shelter-in-place rules. But I don't think we can count on that degree of cooperation persisting indefinitely.
Right, right. In terms of the political institutions, I mean, it seems like this will be a very clear, or maybe even a master course on how our federalist system works with, the various units of government having their own responsibilities. I guess strikingly is just how uneven the level of services seem to be. But what is your sense of how the institutions of government have been working in the last 16 days or so?
Well, I think, John, you point to something very important. That is, we're talking about, because of the nature of our federalist system, different levels of government. So different states have behaved differently. Some, I think, got out in front of the curve. I think California, I think, is in that category. Others, I forget what the count is the last time I looked, but there's something in the neighborhood of a dozen states, I think, that have not done anything significant in terms of shelter in place, perhaps for defensible reasons. But it's in the very nature of the case, the system we live in, that there's going to be a lot of different levels of government competence and engagement and the identification of proper forms of address to this crisis. All that said, again, I don't think I'm alone in feeling a non-trivial level of frustration about the federal response to this. We do have something called the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's supposed to be in the business of being prepared ahead of time for crises like this. And indeed, there are ways to model things like pandemics and floods and earthquakes and so on. And to have institutions and supplies and practices and protocols in place ahead of time. The motto of the Coast Guard in this country, semper paratus, always ready in Latin. Well, that's what governments should be for, is to foresee possible calamities and get ready for them braced on both feet. And that you could not describe the American federal government's response to this crisis that way so far. You make me think, John, I just happened to see this morning, someone sent me a editorial that appeared a day or two ago in the Irish Times in Dublin. And I don't know if you've seen this, but I printed it out here because it made an impression on me. It opens like this. It says, over more than 2 centuries, the United States has stirred a very wide range of feelings in the rest of the world. Love and hatred, fear and hope, envy and contempt, awe and anger. But there is one emotion that has never been directed towards the US until now: pity. It says it's hard not to feel sorry for Americans. This is an Irish writer.
Right.
And, we like to think that we have been the city on a hill and a beacon of hope and inspiration and opportunity and so on for the rest of the world. And for many decades, especially the decades immediately after World War II, I think that you could make that case quite plausibly. But it's hard to make that case today.
Well, and I saw an interview you gave in which you were kind of tracing the last couple of decades, and you cited Ronald Reagan's first inaugural, where he famously said, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." And in the remarks I saw, you suggested that this, that this was a really stark statement. And then, I guess a dozen or so years later, Bill Clinton said, the era of big government is over. So as we look at this really faltering federal effort, is this kind of the bookend to that assertion in 1981?
Well, look, this is an issue that goes deep into our history and our political DNA, you might say. I mean, as early as the late 18th century, the time of the American Revolution, Thomas Paine and James Madison, some of our original thinkers, were identifying government as a necessary evil. But note the word evil. And we set up a federalist and federal style of government in our Constitution that is premised on the idea that too much power invested in the central authority is a very dangerous proposition. We didn't want a monarchy. We wanted the famous system of checks and balances to make sure that nobody could wield too much power over us for very long at a time. And that's our system. That is our constitutional system, and it has its virtues. It liberates all kinds of energies in civil society. We pride ourselves on that, but it has its liabilities as well, especially in the face of crises like this one, or I would say in the face of more deep-seated, less dramatic crises, I'll use that word advisedly again, like climate change or infrastructural collapse or inequality, things that don't hit us right between the eyes the way a pandemic does, but that are deep structural problems. And we have difficulty in our system mustering the resources, focusing the resources to cope with those. Again, you make me think once again, John, of another conversation I had in China, not on this last visit, but actually the first time I was there 5 years ago. And I rode a high-speed rail train between Beijing and Shanghai. And later had a conversation with a Chinese political scientist. And he said, well, where have you been the last few days? And I said, well, I took the high-speed rail to Shanghai. He said, well, how was it? And I said, well, it was great. And it is. It goes 200 miles an hour. It's antiseptically clean. It's quiet. It's smooth. The service is outstanding. It was just great. So he said, well, you should stay longer and take some more rides on our other 15 high-speed rail lines. I said, well, have to go home tomorrow or the next day. And he said, well, by the way, he said, how many high-speed rail lines do you have in your country? And I said, well, we don't have any. And he looked very puzzled. And he said, well, how can that be? Why is that? So I went through a little rehearsal of what I was just talking about here a few minutes ago. But we have a political system purpose-built by design to make it hard to make decisions at the center and do things on a scale and so on. And he kept looking more and more perplexed as I was going on. And I thought, well, maybe I'm using vocabulary that's just beyond his reach, or the concept's just so alien. So finally, he kind of lit up. And he said, I get it. He said, your problem is your system. That's the problem. I said, yeah, that's it. And he said, well, why don't you change it? He said, we've changed ours 3 times in the last 100 years, and look where we are. Well, time for another civics lesson. It's not that easy to change a 230 or 40-year-old constitutionally rooted system.
David, in terms of political leadership, I guess that's the piece that also is very striking. And having read your book last summer, Freedom from Fear, I mean, obviously at the center of it is Franklin Roosevelt. And I have to say, your book was very instructive because I'd always seen Roosevelt as this master politician, wily, shrewd, tough. But you depicted him also as a statesman. I mean, someone who had a real strategic vision. And I thought, I mean, as these last 2 months have unfolded, and plus in your book, you had other people such as George Marshall and Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and Herbert Hoover, and others. And even with our faulty and imperfect system, if we had a different type of leadership in the executive branch, and whether play off of either a Roosevelt or an Eisenhower, how would the world look had one of them been in power, say in January of this year?
Well, let me remind us of an old axiom about you have to be heard to be believed. You have to hear it to believe it. Well, the inverse of that is, I think, no less true and maybe even more analytically useful. You have to be believed to be heard. In other words, people have to have confidence and trust in you if they're going to pay attention to you. Mm. And Franklin Roosevelt had that kind of relationship with most, the huge majorities of American citizens. They had confidence in him, they had trust in him. And the artful use of, just in terms of political craft, of the famous fireside chats is, I suppose, the case study in how credibility and trust and confidence in political leadership is good for the body politic, particularly if that kind of trust is cultivated on the basis of frank recognition of the real data and facts and so on. So again, I don't want to get into the terribly tortured territory of comparing personalities, but having said that, to compare the tone and the consequence and effect and reception of Roosevelt's fireside chats with these daily coronavirus briefings that have come out of the White House in the last few weeks is a study in contrasts. They're wholly different kinds of occasions. Roosevelt was reassuring and avuncular and calm and cool and factual, and did not go beyond his competence in the things that he was advising or counseling. And again, you just wouldn't use those forms of description to talk about what we've been hearing from our federal leadership lately.
And you also use the word empathetic too. With Roosevelt, I mean, there really did convey a sense that he understood the plight of the steel worker in Pittsburgh and the school teacher in Des Moines and the factory worker in Birmingham. I mean, there was a sense of, he said fewer words, but didn't he convey a sense of really understanding the plight of what people were going through?
Yes, he did. And again, I think for historians and contemporaries of his, even there's some mystery to this, because his own upbringing and formation was in a highly sheltered blue blood Hudson River squirearchy. But somehow or other, this is part of the mystery of his personality and biography, he connected with people of very different backgrounds.
How do you kind of disentangle the really faulty federal response so far?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, John. It's a good historian's question. And I think it is a tangle, and I think historians are going to be trying to disentangle it for a long time to come. So we don't know. We can't say with any great degree of confidence what the comprehensive answer is to your question. But I do think there are several things to be noted that will probably figure prominently in any future historical account of this. One is structural, that, as we were discussing earlier, that we have a federal government that by design was built in the late 18th century to be kind of under-resourced, you might say, and to be difficult to manipulate from the center. That's just part of the constitutional apparatus that we have. There have been major exceptions to that observation. World War II, I suppose, would be the most conspicuous in recent history, where the federal government really stepped up and mobilized all kinds of resources and pursued that conflict to a victorious conclusion. But the structural factor is there. It's just part of our political system. But there have also been more recent events where I think, the political leadership, I don't mean just the current administration either, has something to answer for. Why George W. Bush, Bush 43, and I believe it was 2006, I might have the year wrong, but anyway, when he was president, gave a speech at the NIH, which you can find on YouTube actually, in which he advocated creating a unit in the federal government to anticipate future pandemics and to do all the kinds of things. This is 15 years ago he was advocating this. All the kinds of things that are now becoming part of the conventional wisdom of what to do going forward. Better monitoring apparatus all over the world so you could see these things coming when they were incipient still, and you could nip them in the bud. Stockpiling medical resources of all kinds, not just medicines, but also what we now call PPE, personal protective equipment, and so on. So the idea that we should do this is not new. It's pretty commonsensical, and President Bush had it in mind, and he advocated for it rather strenuously. We didn't do it. So how do we explain this? To repeat something I said a few minutes ago, what are governments for if not to prepare their societies for these kinds of stresses and crises?
David, just a few minutes ago, you read that a bit of the quote from the Irish Times. And I guess a big part of this is just the international component. Obviously, this is a global crisis of the world. And, it seems like in an earlier era, both the United States would at least show more internal domestic competence, but also there would be a more aggressive outreach to world leaders. And without being, obviously the Americans have sometimes been a bit arrogant and so forth, but there was at least a kind of a sense of common spirit, of collegiality, of respecting others. Talk about how America's role in the world has been altered by this crisis.
Well, actually, I'd make your point even a little more deeply, I guess I'd say, that the American posture in the world has not just been one of good fellowship and cooperation, but actually the United States in the years immediately after World War II was the architect of a whole set of institutions that were meant to facilitate international cooperation and suppress international violent competition. The United Nations is probably the single most famous, but there are others that played an enormous role in not only pacifying the world in the years after World War II, but also prospering the world. I think the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization, and there's a whole array of other multilateral institutions. And I'm not alone in thinking that that moment and the creation of that international architecture is, in many ways, this country's distinctive contribution to the history of the international system. And it worked quite well, not perfectly. And you used the word arrogance, and I think the United States misstepped many times in that period. But there has been no grande guerre between major powers for 3/4 of a century. That's some kind of achievement in the vexed annals of human history going back over many centuries. And the world's collective or aggregate standard of living has improved markedly in the last 3/4 of a century. Again, not least of all, thanks to that lattice work of institutions that the United States put in place. And there are at least two current crises that call for an even deeper degree of international cooperation and multilateral consultation and joint activity. One, of course, is the current pandemic. It respects no jurisdictional or political boundaries. It by its very nature, it demands some kind of coordinated global counterpunch. The other, I mentioned earlier, but it has some of the similar properties to a pandemic, is climate change, which again is something that no single jurisdiction can really effectively cope with. There has to be cross-border cooperation, international cooperation, if we're ever going to save the planet from heating up beyond the point when it becomes habitable. So the United States, I think, this is my personal historian's judgment, had a leadership position in international society in the couple of generations, at least after World War II, that on balance was quite benign and beneficial for humanity as a whole. And we now in this century are facing globally scaled challenges that call for deepening those mechanisms of collaborative effort and cooperation. And unfortunately, the whole America First slogan strategy points us in exactly the opposite direction. And I think that is really going to the extent that becomes the guiding principle of our foreign policy going forward, it makes for trouble.
David, when you were here in September, you towards the end of your talk, you quoted Winston Churchill in 1946. He was no longer the prime minister, but was of course still a global leader of great consequence. And he made that remark. He said, "The United States stands at the summit of the world." 80 years later, it's hard to kind of overstate the degree that has diminished. What can be done to start at least not continuing the descent downward, but to start moving back up towards that summit? I mean, what is the scenario by which the United States regains some of its standing in the world?
Well, I don't think it's going to be easy. I think we've squandered a lot of goodwill and political capital, and we've weakened international institutions, for example, by retreating from the Paris Climate Accord, by withdrawing, in my view, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. So I think we've got some really arduous reconstruction work to do. That remark of Churchill's that you refer to, actually, he made it on August 16th, 1945, the day after the Japanese government had signaled its readiness to surrender, which it did a couple of weeks later, formally. And you're right, he said, "The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world." But then his next couple of sentences were also important. I can't quote them exactly, I don't have the text in front of me, but I can come pretty close. He said, "The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. I rejoice that it should be so. Let her use her power, not just for herself alone, but for the benefit of all mankind, and a new day will dawn in the history of humanity." that's 90% accurate.
Right.
That recollected quote. Well, you know, it might sound corny to say so, but I do believe that does capture something important about America's international posture and leadership and consequence in the, let's say, broadly speaking, the generation of World War II and the couple of decades thereafter. And to repeat what I said a minute ago, I think that was for the good, not just of this country, but for much of humanity. And we no longer have the relative power in the world that we did in 1945. We no longer stand alone at the summit of the world. The Chinese are right there next to us, just to take one example. But that whole ethos of trying to build institutional, real, concrete platforms for international collaboration to address problems that are common to all humanity, that's a distinctive American approach, and I just really get nervous if I think we're going to reject it.
I mentioned the textbook that you've written, which I have the 17th edition. I don't know if there's an 18th one that's in.
Not yet. You have the most.
Okay, good. Well, good. But as I was browsing through it last night, I was just thinking that if you were to write the 18th edition, and when you were, if called upon to do a chapter on this moment, obviously we don't know what's going to happen, so you can't write that chapter now. But what are the questions you will try to answer? What is the framework that you're going to try to set to look at this particular moment, and both to understand the moment, but also to understand its larger importance?
Well, John, the short answer is I don't know. For the reason you correctly call our attention to, that we don't know how this story ends. So historians are always wary about anticipating the future. We don't have any data from the future. And I have to tell you, in the current edition, the one you mentioned, the 17th edition, I have a co-author, Elizabeth Cohen at Harvard. And in our division of labor, it fell to me to draft the first version of our concluding several pages, which embraced the first couple of years of the Trump administration. And to be honest with you, I sweat bullets writing that. I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it many, many times, because we try to be as objective and nonpartisan as possible in the pages of that book. We're not trying to grind political axes, but really to encourage students to think historically. And I had to overcome a lot of my own political biases and predilections to write that, and it was very, very difficult. That will be no less true of writing about the current episode. I have a lot of prior political reflexes, you might say, that will no doubt come into play, but I'm going to have to try to check those against some standard of fairness and objectivity. Might come out in the same place in the end anyway, but you got to be cautious about such things. But I do think, again, I'm repeating myself perhaps, but I do think this crisis tells us something about the price we pay for the highly disarticulated federalist and federal system that we have. And again, to repeat what I said earlier, it has many virtues, and there are many aspects about it that we have a right to be proud of, but it has some problems and liabilities as well. And I think anticipating crisis and preparing for that is something that is really incumbent upon our central government to do in much more comprehensive ways than we've seen. And again, the future is going to hold crises not only in the medical dimension, but also in the climate dimension that are going to be severe. And if we're not ready, we're going to get clobbered. And we're going to get hit hard anyway, but we can mitigate that kind of damage and get on with our lives more quickly than otherwise if we're prepared.
Do you think there's a scenario where this might even give a kind of a resurgence of attention to just the importance of solid, competent governance, and just by the absence of it, people just get a renewed sense that this is, you can have big debates about the size and scope of the government, but you need to have a government that works well and efficiently, and that maybe we haven't paid sufficient attention and given sufficient resources to having a functioning government at all levels.
John, you've just described my most optimistic and reasonably optimistic hope about what the consequence of this might be, that it will demonstrate the value, indeed the necessity, of competent government. And the idea, again, go back to Ronald Reagan, that government is not the solution, government is the problem, is just a slogan that is simply is not adequate to the times we face and are likely to face.
Right. David, before we started, you had mentioned that you had written a couple of things recently that maybe some of our listeners would like to look up and focus on. Could you briefly describe two of the projects that you had mentioned?
Well, one was released today by the Stanford News Service. I'm not sure exactly what platforms it's on out there, but it was just an interview that we did, a question and answer thing that I did with a person from Stanford News Service about comparing this crisis to the Great Depression. So that's one. It's very brief. It's fewer than 800 words. And then Carl Eikenberry, former coalition commander in Afghanistan, and then later the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. He and I collaborated on a piece that was published in an online platform called Lawfare yesterday morning in Lawfare, in which we tried to tease out some of the implications of thinking about this crisis in terms of a war. Is it really a war against the virus, and do we have a wartime president, and so on? And where we ended up, it so often happens, you start out with one idea and it leads you down a different track. Where we ended up, what we ended up talking about in that piece is what are likely to be the intergenerational consequences of this episode, or the different generational impacts that the crisis is going to leave a very different mark on people depending on where they stand in the age distribution. It's going to be a different story for young people, different story for old people. And though we don't say this in the piece, there are some people who are beginning to talk out loud about something that's a taboo subject, very difficult morally, politically, every other way, is what's the value of a life, and are all lives equally valuable? Is the life of a 3-year-old kid more or less valuable than the life of a 97-year-old great-grandparent? That's an extremely painful discussion to have, but how you answer that question has real policy consequences and real prices, and the prices aren't necessarily distributed equitably or evenly, and that's an enormously difficult conversation for this or any other society to have, but I think we might need to have it.
Very good. David, just one final question. And it came from one of our listeners who sent us an email wondering about just the complexity of governing in this era in which facts are seemingly in dispute. I mean, there isn't a common basis of fact by which the public seems to be discussing what's going on. I mean, obviously the polarization of the country is well known. Is this something that also is a significant inhibitant to us moving forward, do you think? Just this kind of lack of factual base to have our discussions?
Yes, but don't ask me for the solution to this. But I think we're living in a moment where we see the convergence of three factors or three vectors of development. One is the fragmentation of the mass media. You and I, John, lived in a lifetime, a moment in history when there were a handful of major media organs, and most people got more or less the same news all the time. Now there's hundreds, and then amplified even further by social media. So there are all kinds of platforms where people get their daily dose of what passes for news. So that's just a structural factor that it's very difficult to see how that could be ever reversed. But that intersects with something that we've become aware of in the work of behavioral economists like Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, called confirmation bias, that all human beings have a pronounced tendency to agree with and affirm views that confirm their pre-existing views. And that's just a fact of human nature, and it's true of everybody. Nobody has a monopoly on that one. And then you have the third element of this, and that is that there are characters out there who are willing to manipulate those first two factors, fragmented media and confirmation bias, to perpetrate things that are demonstrably false, but nonetheless convince enough people that they become actionable. So I suppose drinking Lysol or chewing Clorox tablets or whatever would be a comic instance of such a thing, were it not in fact the reality.
Well, I'm going to actually end this by urging all of my friends here in Carbondale and across the country, if they're looking for some reading during this time. My project last summer was reading David's book, Freedom from Fear, and it's 900 pages, but it is both amazing scholarship and incredible writing. I mean, I was reading passages to my wife about character sketches and summaries of cultural trends and all. It's really amazing scholarship and writing. So everyone who's hunkered down at home should call Amazon and get their copy of David's book and read it while we wait for this moment to pass. So David, thank you so much. We're very sorry about the technical problems. We'd love to stay in touch with you and maybe even get you back to Carbondale and when there's easier, happier times.
Well, thanks, John. You know where to find me, and I would happily come back. So thanks again for your making this occasion possible.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. And thank everyone for watching. And again, we're sorry about the technical glitches, but please share this with your friends, and we will have this online on YouTube later today. So thank you so much.